law students. This is Jonathan Lipson with The Real Deal on Contracts. Today we're going to talk about exit and restitution. If you're in my class, this is Unit 8. If you step back for a moment and think about it, to this point we've talked about sort of two basic approaches to remedies. Number one, expectation. Put the non-breacher where she expected to be in performance. Number two, reliance. We want to give the non-breacher any out-of-pocket expenditures they might have made in reasonable reliance on the contract. But a third approach that is not at all uncommon in the event of a breach is for the buyer or whoever the aggrieved party is to simply walk away, to exit the contract. This then necessarily requires us to answer a question that we haven't yet really addressed, which is, well, how do we know there's been a breach at all? And that's what we're going to talk about now. There are really three things to focus on. Number one, what failures constitute a breach. Number two, if there has been a breach, kind of what are the rights of the parties under the UCC in particular to fix the breach. And number three, if the buyer has accepted goods under the UCC, what effect does that have? Does that mean that they can't say that there's a breach at all? And the answer, of course, turns out to be no, but we need to get to that by understanding what happens under the statute. Okay, let's start with whether there's been a breach at all. As in other contexts, the UCC and the common law set out different tests to determine whether there has been a breach of contract. Under the UCC, we have something called the perfect tender rule. 2601 says that if the goods fail in any respect to conform to the contract, the buyer may reject. Right? Full stop. That's it. We call that the perfect tender rule, not because the goods have to be perfect in and of themselves, but they must conform exactly to the terms of the contract. When does the buyer have to let the seller know that there was some nonconformity? They must do so in a reasonable time. As you'll see from the Miller case, it's not entirely clear how long that is, but usually sooner is better than later if you're the buyer. Under the common law, we don't require perfect tender. We don't require, exact conformity with the contract. Instead, we have something called the substantial performance rule. If a party has substantially performed with their obligations under the contract, then there is no breach. So, for example, in the Plant v. Jacobs case, we talk a little bit about what that looks like in the case of building contracts, right? Builder builds a house or something and turns out that, one of the internal walls is a foot off, but the buyers moved in and then they start to complain about it. The courts can say, you know what? That's not really a material defect. The builder substantially performed, there's slight imperfections, but substantial performance is enough. So two different ways to think about this. Perfect tender rule for the UCC, substantial performance for common law. That's how we know whether there has been a breach. Under the UCC, let's focus now on the rights of the parties in the event that there's been a non-conforming tender. The buyer who says, well, there's an imperfection here, doesn't necessarily get to walk away. Under the UCC 25082, the seller has an opportunity to cure. They get to try to substitute conforming goods or otherwise cure. If they fail to do that, if the seller fails to do that, then we have an unremedied rejection, and the buyer gets to say, yep, there's a breach, and pursue the remedies under 2711 or in reliance, as we've seen so far, or walk away, exit. The seller has a reasonable time to effect the cure, and again, as with rejection, we don't know exactly how long that is, but sooner is better than later if you're the seller. A third question that arises involves what happens, what constitutes a buyer's acceptance of goods, and what does that mean? The UCC makes a distinction between affirmative acceptance and implicit acceptance. Affirmative acceptance occurs where the buyer tells the seller, I accept. The goods are conforming and I take them, or the goods are not conforming, but I'm going to take them anyway. Buyer's had a reasonable opportunity to inspect and says, these look good enough. That's not that tricky. Implicit acceptance occurs where the buyer's had a reasonable opportunity to inspect the goods and they haven't said anything at all. So they haven't rejected, but they haven't necessarily affirmatively accepted. That's treated as an acceptance under UCC Section 2606 1B. Similarly, under UCC 2606, if the buyer has had a chance to inspect and they just act inconsistently with the seller's ownership of the goods, for example, they start to use the goods themselves, the court's going to say, well, that looks like you accepted the goods, buyer. You may not have affirmatively accepted them, but if you acted as if they were yours, they're yours. You've accepted them. What's the effect of acceptance? Well, it means you can't now say that the goods are non-conforming and reject them. It also means under 2607, you got to pay. If you're the buyer who's accepted goods, you must pay. No duh, right? But it's important to remember that. You'll see later in the semester that if it turns out that there is still a problem with the goods that the buyer's accepted, there may be what's known as a breach of warranty claim. You don't have to worry about that at all right now. Just make a note of it. Under 2313, 2314, acceptance by the buyer does not eliminate warranty claims. The final thing that we need to think about with respect to acceptance of goods by a buyer and sort of what how we kind of interpret breach or understand breach under the UCC is the buyer's right to revoke their acceptance. Under 2608 of the UCC, acceptance by the buyer is not the end of the story. They can revoke acceptance, but only in the limited circumstances provided by 2608. Specifically, the buyer has to show that there is a nonconformity, that the nonconformity substantially impairs the value of the goods to him or her, and that the buyer accepted the goods either on the reasonable assumption that the nonconformity would be cured, and it wasn't, or that the buyer hasn't discovered the cure because it was the nonconformity rather, because it would have been hard to discover the problem, or the seller assured the buyer that there was no problem. So, acceptance is not the end. You can still revoke acceptance if you're the buyer, but only if you can show that the problem substantially impaired the value of the goods to you, to the buyer, and that you'd accepted because you either reasonably thought the problem would be fixed or it wasn't really possible to discover the problem. As with everything under the UCC involving breach, we've seen that there aren't specific timing rules. The buyer only has a reasonable time to revoke acceptance from the time that they've discovered the problem or should have discovered the problem. What's the effect of revoking acceptance? Well, it then under 2608 means that the buyer can deem the goods rejected. So it takes you back to rejection and back to the buyer's remedies, including under 2711. Expectation or reliance, etc. That's the lay of the land on breach under the UCC for the most part, but also a little bit of common law and how we deal with the back and forth between buyer and seller. We look to determine whether there has been a breach such that we trigger a discussion of the remedies that we've been talking about to this point. That then is the real deal on breach and exit. Next unit will focus on restitution.